Good morning, Francis.
Good morning, Sonia. Good morning, Sean.
Hey, how you doing, man?
All right, man. How are you?
Yeah,
Good to see you. Really good to see you. Francis, of course, been on with us before, writer, researcher, holder of yellow boards. And Francis is joining us really to have this conversation about September the 11th. As we know, 22 years ago today, commonly known as 9/11. The official story is I got to try and say this without smiling. I don't mean this in humor in any way, but I struggle to even relay this official story. The official story is 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners, possibly even 5. They are saying there might be one that was missing. On Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001, the hijackers were said to have crashed the first 2 planes into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. The third succeeded in crashing into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the US Department of Defense, and the 4th plane crashed in rural Pennsylvania. The attacks killed, that we're told, nearly 3,000 people. 2 more have just been identified this weekend, coincidentally. And there are many outstanding questions. And Francis is here to help us work our way through this, really. Francis, can you remember where you were when you heard that 9/11 had happened?
Yeah, I can actually. I'd got a round the world ticket. Things weren't going right for me, and I was in New Zealand working as a lifty on a ski hill called Mount Hutt on the South Island. And so I was getting up in the morning, and we lived in this little A-frame. We had the top of the triangle of an A-frame thing, and the guy who, when it was a strange guy who was the face of Viagra in New Zealand, and his wife was downstairs, and she was unpleasant to be around. So when we woke up to get our breakfast, it was happening, and she said, "Oh, there's a plane crash in New York that's hit the Twin Towers." So we didn't really like her company very much. So we were like, "All right, yeah, whatever." And then she said, "There's another one gone in as well." And then we saw it on the news. So before I went to work, we had to get this Jeep up the mountain. I saw the footage, but I didn't spend all day in front of the TV. So I wasn't like full of the propaganda and full of the news. And I just saw this footage of this building. To my mind, and the words I had on the day was unfurling. It sort of unfurled on the way down. And straight away, it seemed to me that it sort of contradicted my understanding of the natural world. And I am still not an architect or an engineer or in the building trade. I was just looking at thinking, there's something odd about that. And I was asking people, well, how did it fall like that? Because it seems just like it just unravel. And people were saying to me, oh, it was the jet fuel. And that didn't make sense to me on the day. I was thinking, and again, I hadn't listened to all the stuff. I'd just seen the visuals. And there's something strange about that. But I thought as well, at the time, well, maybe it's like the Titanic at the time, because, people ask questions about the thinking of the Titanic now, but they used to say that was unsinkable. Maybe it's one of these strange things where people think it's much stronger than it is, and somebody much cleverer than me is going to work this out. But I remember being disconcerted by what I'd seen. It didn't really make sense to me. And this was just the Twin Towers. I knew nothing about anything. I had no idea that the government might work against the people or anything. I didn't know about false flag operations. I just thought that does still seem a bit weird. And people gave me the official line, and I thought the jet fuel's going to melt the whole building. It's like, I mean, I didn't know there was 110 stories at the time, but there was a lot of stories. And I was thinking, if you've got jet fuel at the top, how is it going to melt the structure at the bottom? And just simple questions, just simple, ordinary layman questions. And then a few years later, like maybe 2 or 3 years later, YouTube had videos on it, and it used to have a top 10, which they don't have anymore.
Oh no, YouTube has been completely sanitized on 9/11.
And they used to have 2 or 3 9/11 videos. So I thought, well, I had questions about that, and I watched it, and then I found out about this thing called Building 7. And I was thinking, what's this Building 7 thing? And I watched the Building 7 thing on YouTube thinking, is this real? Why have I not heard about this on the mainstream news? Is this one of these internet spoofs that if I repeat to my friends, I'm going to be a crank and a fool gullible to believe that this actually happened? But if it's real, that wasn't hit by a plane. It didn't come. It comes down like a controlled demolition. And again, once I saw Building 7, I thought, if that is real, if that's not some internet prank, there's no, how else could that building come down? And then I started to look into it, and eventually over time, first of all, I saw this YouTube, in those days, YouTube you used to post videos no longer than I think 10 or 11 minutes. So it was chapters. It was about 30 chapters about 9/11. And I don't know now. I still don't know what film that was. But I went through that. And I remember being up, watching it over and over again. It's about 4 a.m. thinking, and it was talking about how people had insider trading and bet on the airlines. They could call them put options. they bet on the share prices to go down for the airlines that crashed on the day. And I was thinking, and it was all very coherent and very measured and very well put together. And the more you found out, and eventually it comes to the point where you find out there's thousands of architects and engineers who are giving some kind of credibility to the idea that this is the mainstream story is not right. And at that point, you have to look around and think, well, and I had did a lot of study eventually, obviously, on it, and started to work out, that this was the official story could not be true. And it starts to dismantle your idea of what you're being told and who you can trust.
And that is absolutely the truth. I think that it had such a profound effect on people worldwide. And, you're really fortunate in many respects that you missed out on that initial first impression thing, because that first impression that was given out remained the only impression for many people. They cannot erase this idea that they've been told. And you're absolutely right. Obviously, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, led by Richard Gage, representing at least 1,500 architects. And I should say, shout out to John Mack. He did send me, good morning to you, John, did send me a very interesting video yesterday about questions about architects and engineers for 9/11 and about whether they were more of a controlled opposition, only asking certain questions, etc., etc. We always get this, obviously. But going back to what you said, the 3 skyscrapers all coming down, I think building 7 is the one that's triggered many people into knowing that the story is not as told, right?
Yeah, I mean, the building 7 was one of the most secure buildings in the world. It held all the kind of alphabet agencies, FBI, CIA, IRS. It had the Salomon Brothers Bank in there. It had all kinds of government agencies. It had the Office for Emergency Management for New York City, which was supposed to manage the emergencies, and that was abandoned on the day. There were witnesses one called Barry Jennings and Michael Hess, who tried to leave building 7 on the day because they became aware that it was unsafe, and as they were leaving, there were explosions going off, and it blew out the stairwell and forced them back onto the 6th floor, so they couldn't leave, and they were shouting from windows, and they watched the firemen run away and come back and run away and come back, which they later realized was probably when the Twin Towers were coming down. So if that's correct, there were explosions going off in building 7 before the Twin Towers came down. And Barry Jennings died a couple of days before one of the reports came out about it. So these guys gave interviews to camera to the media in the street. But Barry Jennings certainly did, saying what had happened to him on the day being trapped in building 7. So there's lots of questions about that. But even if we didn't have witnesses, you can see the building fall suddenly, symmetrically, and at free fall speed, and that's been accepted by.
It literally turns into dust in midair. That's what it does as it unfurls all the way down, doesn't it?
Well, actually, building 7, I wouldn't say, because you can still see the rubble.
No, but sorry, I'm talking about the Twin Towers. Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah. Building 7 just comes down as a classic controlled demolition. It was shown to a leading controlled demolition expert called Danny Jowenko in Europe. I think he was Dutch, and he's watching it and he's just saying, yeah, this is a classic demolition. And he said, on the same day, and he couldn't get his head around it was the same day. He was saying, same day, are you sure it's the same day? He goes, well, they must have worked very fast. And anyway, then he died. He was just a person asked for comment. Anyway, he died when his car struck a tree in a single car accident.
Right.
But the building 7 is even there's FEMA, who is a government agency. They tested a lot of the evidence was got rid of, but they tested some steel and some from building 7, and they found what they call a eutectic, which was kind of an accelerant, or kind of that allowed greater temperatures, and it's suggestive of explosive materials in building 7. And also there was foreknowledge. One of the key things as well that gets people's interest is the foreknowledge of it, so that the media were waiting for it to come down. The firefighters were standing around waiting for it to come down. Okay,
right.
So, but this is important because and BBC reported it coming down 20 minutes before it happened, and there was, I think, CNN were waiting for it to come down. Lots of news agencies were there waiting for it to come down. So you might think, oh, it's a chaotic day, and there's things going on, but all the reasons they gave for it coming for this foreknowledge were like, okay, it's been hit by some debris, or it's on fire.
Oh, it was ridiculous. Absolute, no plausible excuse.
Were not credible even by the official report. So people on the day knew it was coming down, but it took the investigators 7 years to come up for a reason why it did came down.
Yeah.
And the reason they gave was that it was the steel frame skyscrapers have never fallen down by fire before. So it's like predicting, I don't know, something that's never happened before.
Yeah,
and expecting
absolutely
it.
ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But Francis, let me take you on to this, because I think this is something that people really often say to me. And that is, I absolutely know unquestionably this was an inside job. I know it. It is absolutely apparent to me, right? But the one thing that people always say, and you address this, is why would the government kill its own people, Francis? Why?
Well, I think with the way we look at politics, we think we vote for our leaders and so on, and that they operate in our best interests. But then when you look at what they actually do, so they need to convince the people for a cause for war. Like in that instance, there was a confluence of different interests, but 9/11 gave us a reason to go to war. And then they gave us weapons of mass destruction, which everybody accepts was a lie. So we already know that they'll lie to get into wars that kill millions of people. So we can accept that they kill foreigners over there and people that, you know, for some reason, there's always this idea that when they report the wars, that this many British soldiers have died, but they don't really count up the Iraqis or the Afghanis because they're somehow lesser. Just because they were born, or they live slightly further away, you know. So they have to convince people for the justification of a war. But when you start to look at history, as I have done, and people do, once you start to realize some of the recent history is not been given to us in a truthful way, you start to realize that every single war begins with a false flag operation, and historically it becomes to be accepted. So, for example, like if we look at the first Gulf War, it was babies and incubators. If we look at Vietnam War, it was the Bay of Tonkin. These are accepted to be lies. It's accepted. It's accepted that Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen because America was needed to join the Second World War. It's accepted that the sinking of Lusitania was in some way, so it was a constructed event. It was a real event, but it was sort of brought about by the Western powers because they wanted America in the First World War. So every single one of these wars, and so you have to deceive the population, because the population never wants war. We don't want to go and fight innocent people on the other side of the world.
Strangely, on my research last night, I think I found quite a large connection to why America were over there in the first place. So a lot of people don't know, but in the in the 90s, obviously, Afghanistan was very big for poppy supply. But when the Taliban took over, they stopped poppy production running up to 2000. 2001, 9/11 happened and America went back into Afghanistan. And then the British got involved in 2002 as counter-narcotics. So we would go over there to destroy these poppy fields. And it wasn't until Obama got in power in 2009 that he was like, actually, poppy eradication is not actually benefiting the Americans to get secret intel on the Taliban, so they're going to let the farmers do it. And what is it even more mad, right? Because then you have to take into account, since Obama got in presidency, the opioid crisis in America shot through the roof. So the different tactics for war we used there, because the Americans were just taking the poppies from Afghanistan. And this is where I actually think the whole thing actually ties back to Big Pharma. And that's why it's not that the government will allow false flags to kill the American people, because the government actually don't rule the population, but things like Big Pharma will allow it because they need to get that opium. And then check this, what I found last night. So there was a court case by Purdue, who make Oxycontin, which is the biggest opioid killing drug on the planet. Oxycontin is just straight Afghan poppy, right? On October the 21st, 2020, Purdue pleaded guilty to the Oxycontin crisis in America. 6 months later, we all saw the Taliban celebrating and America leaving, and they got left with all those trucks. Do you remember Joe Biden's disgraceful leaving of Afghanistan? That was literally 6 months after Purdue had to admit that they will no longer sell Oxycontin. And then all of a sudden, America left Afghanistan.
I think, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's practically my point. So from like 2000, I think, let me find this, the drug trade and counter-narcotics policies in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2021 all tie in to the fact that the Taliban had quit making poppy in 2000, and then the production went straight back up when they got into war. And then now that America have left again, the Taliban have yet again banned poppy, because in their religion, drugs and narcotics are not allowed.
I mean, that is entirely feasible in many respects, because these agendas usually bring in many other agendas all at one time as well, right?
Yeah, so I was going to say definitely gold, heroin, oil were involved, and also in Building 7 you had all the financial accounts, the investigations for the Lieber scandal, which went up in the demolition. There was also the project for the New American Century, which
so
was
much to be gained.
The project for the New American Century, which was the way they were going to shape basically America's empire for this century that we're in now, and they needed a catalyzing event to establish American dominance in the Middle East and militarily. So this was the catalyzing event, which was the new Pearl Harbor, which was 9/11, which killed almost the same amount of people as Pearl Harbor. It had a parallel there. So yeah, there was a whole confluence of interest that came together, and it was their way of also beginning the erosion of the civil liberties of the people. They brought in the Patriots Act, they brought in the Terrorism Act here.
Right.
So 9/11 was a catalyst for these things where people started to accept being patted down and searched. I mean, it wasn't just on airplanes either. For example, I remember going to the British Museum a few years later. It was a Da Vinci exhibition or something, and they have these winding queues outside now, and just the British Museum staff will go through your bags and things like this. And that's in lots of museums and theatres and galleries now. It's like that, and people accept it because and they're doing it now
so
with
many
COVID.
Reasons.
Now,
because we had a new enemy. The new enemy was Muslim, poor Muslims,
and they were everywhere. Every man with a backpack who didn't have a white skin was a potential terrorist.
Terrible, absolute. The demonization of people.
Do you know? Sorry, Sonia. Before 2001, I think in the year 2000, 0 Americans died from terrorism, and then they started the war on terror all of a sudden in 2001.
Yeah,
and it's like.
It's still a huge story, though, isn't it? It's still significant to us. That's the thing. And
of course.
How has it? I mean, go on, Sean. What are you going to say?
You know the actual shape of the Twin Towers, Sonia.
Yeah.
If you actually look at them, and with them being steel, the way they are structured is like a giant, like 2 giant tuning forks. And when you strike the top of a tuning fork, it will resonate a frequency, and everybody was looking at it like a monolith of grief and pain.
Yes.
And that was kind of like, whoa. I think it was like a mass grief. It was like I think the prior to that, it was probably Princess Diana, that the world felt that sort of like collective pain.
Yeah.
So
True.
Tied to it as well.
Francis, before you leave us, I mean, because there's still so much to discuss about this, which we're not going to get in, unfortunately, but I do think this is really important. And that is, how has it shaped the way that we view other news stories? Because it's definitely changed us. It was like Sean said, it was so seismic. It was so huge. It's affected us on levels that we don't even yet know, probably. But how do you think it has impacted us?
Well, I think for those of us who know that it was the story was false, the official story was not true. It tells us that, and I think this was the profound thing that a lot of people maybe at the time didn't realize, but they've realized it since 2020, is that it tells us that the governments are prepared to kill their own people and for their agendas that are kept secret from the public, and that the media will conspire to keep that secret and is complicit in this government lie. And that not only will, say, the American government or the British government keep it secret, but you won't hear about it from any governments of the world, which suggests there's some hidden power that somehow enforces silence or complicity. And then, as we've seen since 2020, the global plans can be rolled out that change the face of how we live. And this is what 9/11 was a signal for. It was telling us that things do not operate as we think they do, and and the media doesn't tell us the truth, and that there are people who will actively suppress the truth. That science can be suppressed, which is a very important one recently. The academia is controlled, that your politicians are controlled, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly. They are not telling you the truth, and they're not working in your interest. And once you know that, that puts everybody at threat. And it also taught us that in our unwillingness to face the truth, and that I heard a fireman called Eric Gloyer, who was campaigning for the truth, say that our friends and family can be our bigger enemies than the deep state, which we saw in the COVID times, because they're not willing to face reality. And there's a very interesting piece by Frances Shaw, who's a psychologist, who's the only non-architect or engineer to write anything that's been published by Architects and Engineers for an Island of Truth. And she said that it means that if we can't face the truth, we're like abuse victims in that we're not
Right.
prepared to stand up for ourselves.
Right.
And are we prepared to, she very prescient piece, almost prophetic. She said, are we prepared to take the chance that this government will, these people who've done this, who've killed citizens and gone to war, killed millions of people, that they will altruistically reform themselves? And are we prepared to take the chance that the next time they do something, it won't harm us or our families? And that's exactly what we've seen since 2020. So that's the way in which it informs the way we view this century.
So
Yes,
powerful.
Sadly, when it comes to wealth shifting, humans are collateral damage no matter where we fall into it.
Absolutely. We have to let you go, which is such a pity, but you can
Such a
check
weird
out
world.
Francis's writing, which I'll put a link to. There's a piece that he did on Substack, which I think we referred to before, and that is how do we wake people up? It refers to 9/11, but always a pleasure to have you with us, Francis. And I do really appreciate your take very much. Take good care of yourself, everybody. Francis O'Neill, take good care. Have a good week.
Thank you so much, mate. Cheers.
Bye, Sean. Bye, Sonia.
Bye. Bye. Great thinker.